Welcome to the webinar. We're glad to have you with us this morning. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this Manufacturing Works webinar, where we're going to discuss the 5 common failures of businesses that can lead to a disaster. We invite you to become our friend at Firestorm. And by the way, there's a disclaimer our attorneys like to put in here. The presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The work product we provide must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel, and the information given should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Our introductions today, we've got 3 people that will be participating. Guy Higgins, who's a principal at Firestorm. Guy has extensive experience as a naval officer. He went to the Annapolis Military Academy. Excuse me, the Naval Academy. Guy gets rather upset when I use the wrong terminology. And he's been with Boeing and he's been in the aerospace industry for a number of years. Jennifer is also in the Denver area. She's a principal of Firestorm. Her background is marketing and communications. She likes to help companies devise and implement business concept strategies. And last but by certainly not least is Amanda Hanson with Manufacturing Works in Wyoming. And we're pleased to have her with us. She's been a good supporter and a proud supporter of Firestorm, and we're pleased to have her assistance. Amanda, over to you with the commercial, if you would.
Thank you, Bill. Well, I'm Amanda Hanson with Manufacturing Works, and we are very proud to have Guy and Jennifer with Firestorm available to help our clients in Wyoming. Manufacturing Works, we've been around for years, and we help manufacturers and other businesses in Wyoming grow and get past any hurdles that come up. We've got engineering solutions, business growth solutions, energy efficiency, environmental solutions, business management solutions, business resilience solutions. That's the category that we're talking about today, business resilience. So Guy and Jennifer are going to be talking about the common disasters that can lead to a crisis. So I'll turn it over to them now.
Thanks, Amanda. And this is Guy. And just a really quick piece on Firestorm. We're very proud to be partnering with Manufacturing Works to provide insight and help to Wyoming businesses. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. So we not only help you be prepared for the inevitable disruptions and disasters that lie lurking in the future, but prepare for them in such a way that you can come out of such an event, a disruption, stronger than when you went in. So we believe that we empower people to manage risk and crises. So before we get started on the 5 common failures, we like to just take a look at what's going on in the world today. For the really old people out there, it's Flip Wilson's Church of What's Happening Now. So recent headlines, I think most of you probably saw the headlines that there was a widespread power outage in Detroit. And power outages are things that people say, well, you know, I've got a power outage, and yeah, that's true, but seldom do we have a power outage for an entire city that is not a really major disruption. And certainly that was true in Detroit, particularly for those people who got to spend the entire day in the elevator. But that's one of the least of the things that happens when it goes down like that, because businesses all over the city close, and the economic impact of the city and to the businesses in the city is huge. Also, this year, I hope everyone has their flu shots, because there's an early outbreak being monitored right now, and officials are actually bracing for the worst flu season in years. Now, every year we hear the media say it's going to be the worst flu season in years, but this is not the media saying this. This is actually the health officials at various state and national health organizations that are saying this one could be really bad, and part of it is made worse by the fact that there's some concern that the existing flu shot is only at best partially effective against the strains of flu that we're expecting to see this year. Once again, in their annual rain and flood and landslide festival in California. Lots of problems out there. Of course, California's had a drought for the last 3 years, and what that means for people who aren't familiar with California is that a lot of the vegetation that normally holds the land in place isn't there to hold it in place, and they're at serious risks for flooding, mudslides, and landslides. A lot of problems, and that doesn't sound like it's important to us here in the Front Range, but in fact, if we have suppliers or customers there, it could be. On top of that, World Health Organization has raised the flag on antibiotic-resistant bacteria in India, and they're really concerned because the ease and speed of international travel today means that antibiotic-resistant bacteria in India can be antibiotic-resistant bacteria in your backyard within 24 hours. So there's a real concern about the proliferation of that in India and other developing countries. So on the non-natural disaster side of the house, the Environmental Protection Agency is continuing to pursue rules that are forcing the closure of coal-burning plants. And that has impacts to business because of increased energy costs. It has impacts to business because of the other rules that are being implemented, raising the cost of energy, whether the plants remaining are coal-burning or not. It's raising that cost, potential impact to businesses. Obviously, for those that have been watching the news, civil unrest is continuing based on the Eric Gardner case in New York and the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. Violence outbreaks in Berkeley, California just the last 2 days. Those things are very disruptive, and it doesn't have to be the kind of catastrophe that struck Ferguson. It can be much less violent protests that still impact business and create problems. And for those of you that haven't been in a hospital recently, and I was in one yesterday, there are lots of "Have you been to West Africa recently?" signs all over the place, and lots of "Wash your hands" signs all over the place. While it's faded from the media, the health community and health industry still remains concerned about the potential for Ebola sneaking into the country. So that's something that's still out there on the horizon. Last week, there was a helicopter that crashed into a building in Utah. Obviously, if that happens to your building, that's not going to be a good day for your operations. Yesterday, there was a private jet that crashed into Gaithersburg, Maryland, and it crashed into a residential neighborhood, but a minute earlier or a minute later, it could have been in a business area. So those kinds of things do happen. And then finally, there is a mom down here in Colorado who is suing her employer for wrongful termination that has to do with her recently having given birth. So all sorts of things that are potentially disruptive to us in the business world. Now, with that in hand, I want to talk a little bit about background. So that's just a sample of the headlines. But every year, there are 70,000 natural disasters that occur in the U.S., as that's reported by the Red Cross. That's only the natural disasters. That doesn't talk about automobile accidents. It doesn't talk about train derailments or the power going out in Detroit. That's the natural disasters, 70,000, and that's a lot. Businesses are getting hit by those all the time. And of the businesses that are hit by those disasters and must close their doors and suspend operation, 2 out of every 5 of them never reopen their doors. And of the 3 out of 5 that do reopen their doors, 25% of those fail within 2 years. Then, if that's not bad enough, of the remaining 45% that are still in business at the end of 2 years, most of them are still experiencing financial impacts as a result of that closure. So those are serious things. We don't want to have to suspend or interrupt operations because the impacts are both significant and long-lasting. So with that, we're going to talk about the 5 common failures. Before we get into them specifically, Firestorm has done a significant amount of research looking at and drawing on other people's research, looking at companies that have failed and companies that have not failed as a result of closing because of some kind of an interruption or crisis or disaster. Out of that, we were able to identify 5 different areas that showed up a lot. Were they common across all the failures? Of course not. But and did every failure have one of these? Also, of course not. But these showed up by far and away more than other areas. So these 5 are areas that we need to pay specific attention to. Let's go with the first one, Jennifer. One of the big ones is the lack of control over critical supply chains. And we'll be talking about each one of these. But if you don't understand and control your supply chain, your critical supply chain, those things that suppliers provide to you that keep your operation moving, you're at risk. And we talk about inheriting risk from the supply chain. We'll cover that. This one is really big, and it's an easy one to fix, but it's lack of employee preparedness training. So if we have a plan but we don't have our employees trained, then we're not a whole lot better off than if we don't have a plan. The next one is the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks. So Bill mentioned that I retired from the Navy after a career of 30 years, and I was in naval aviation. And we talk about situational awareness, SA. And to have situational awareness, you have to know what you're looking for, and you have to keep looking for it. And that's what this is. People typically find the obvious ones, but it's important to identify all the threats and risks that you're vulnerable to. The next one, it kind of goes back to that lack of employee training, and that is the failure to conduct exercises and to update plans. It's important to have the plan, it's important to train on it, but it's important to get out there and practice it too so that you become much more adept and have the ability to find flaws and update your plans. And finally, the lack of a crisis communication plan. We've talked to some people who are a little bit surprised that crisis communication is that big a deal, but in fact, it's a huge deal. And we'll talk about this in a little bit here, but it's really important to have thought through who you're going to talk to and what you're going to say. The right time to think of what you're going to say is not when Wolf Blitzer from CNN sticks a microphone under your nose and asks you a really hard question. So let's get into them. Controlling the supply chain. This is a failure to look at and include resilience in your supply chain strategy. So you should have a company strategy, you should have a supply chain strategy that's part of that company strategy, and that supply chain strategy should include resilience in it. How resilient is your supply chain? And that has a couple of components to it. The first thing is how resilient are your suppliers? And to understand that, you have to be able to see into your supply chain. At the first tier, obviously, you know who your first tier suppliers are. What about your second tier suppliers? What about your third tier suppliers? With today's expanding supply chain, almost everybody has a supplier at multiple levels, and it's important to see into that supply chain as far as possible and to understand whether or not those companies are resilient to disruptions. 3 years ago when they had the horrendous flooding in Thailand, I mean, for heaven's sakes, Thailand is the other side of the world. But that really created all sorts of problems because that's where hard drives and electronics for personal computers were being built, and that rippled into, you know, Apple and IBM and Dell and HP and all of the computer companies, and that rippled into companies that for whom they were suppliers, and that rippled into other companies. Huge problems because of one event half a world away. It's important to recognize the threats and risks and resilience that your supply chain has. And of those suppliers, which ones are critical? A critical supplier is one for whom an interruption of their business creates a problem for you quickly. So if you have somebody who's supplying you with titanium and they suspend operations for a month, you're going to have a problem because 100% of the world's titanium supply is already on contract for the next forever. And so if you are in a situation like that, whether it is titanium or whether it's plastic resin, and with that plastic resin, I'm going to tell you a story. There's a company in Germany called Evonik. Evonik is a manufacturing company that provides lots of different things, including plastic resins. They provide plastic resins to the automobile industry, to the electronics industry, and to the piping industry. And they have a plant in southern Germany. That plant experienced a very severe fire. Massive damage to the plant, 2 fatalities to Evonik employees, a real disaster. That plant produced 25% of the world's supply of a particular plastic resin. Overnight, that resin suffered a 25% loss in global availability, 25%. And so obviously Toyota and Fiat and General Motors just said, oh, we'll just wait 6 months while they get the plant back in shape and we just won't be building in 25% fewer cars than that. Sure they did. GM and everybody, GM and Siemens and IBM and everybody spent millions of dollars finding replacements for that plastic resin and doing it overnight if they could. I mean, they just poured resources on it like crazy because they weren't prepared for that catastrophic a kind of a loss. So it can happen to big companies, but it can happen to small companies too. And it's really important to have it because most small companies don't have the resources to throw at it that a General Motors does. Jennifer?
Well, and the other result of that was that Evonik, because all of these companies had to find other vendors for materials and even different materials, Evonik, once they did come back online, had lost a lot of their customers and their market.
And so if you're a supplier, you want to be careful of that too, because you may lose a customer because your operations have been impacted. So once you've recognized, you've got the visibility, you've recognized your critical suppliers, and you put plans in place to deal with that. So those were the failures. Now controlling it, first thing we want to do is we want to develop what we call a map of your supply chain. So that's looking down past that first tier and seeing which companies are being their suppliers and then which companies at the third tier are supplying the second tier. Because we've seen situations where at the third tier there is one company supplying 3 second-tier suppliers who are supplying 4 first-tier suppliers. And what you've got is a bottleneck at that third tier. And so having the visibility down there is really important. So we want to map the supply chain, and then when we do that, we'll be able to identify gaps in our knowledge of the supply chain. Well, we don't know where this is coming from at the second or third tier. And we can try to find that out. And it's important to recognize we're not going to be able to fill all of those gaps in the supply chain because our suppliers may be their proprietary information and they may want to or need to protect that for their business purposes. But once we have that visibility, we can go in and look at those suppliers and understand, are we buying commodities from them? And if we are they really commodities like printer toner, or are they commodities like titanium? Because titanium, while it's a commodity, can also be a critical supplier. Then you may have single source suppliers, and you may have sole source suppliers. A single source supplier is where you have made the decision to buy all of X from one company, even though they're alternative producers. That's a single source. You've made that decision for some kind of strategic or business reason. A sole source supplier is the only guy in the world that can sell you what it is that you need. And it may be because of qualification or capability that the company has to do that. With that in hand, you can identify the ones that can shut you down, and then you can develop your strategy, eliminate the risks where you can, and plan for disruption of those critical suppliers where you can't. Okay, so supply chain. Understanding the risks that you've inherited from your supply chain. Do we have any questions, Bill? Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, and I think we neglected once again to mention at the beginning of the webinar that if you have any questions, you can use the dashboard of your control panel on the side and the chat feature and ask us any questions. We will stop after each of the 5 failures, and if you have any questions, we'll answer them at that time, and we'll also give time at the end of the webinar to answer your questions.
Okay.
So with no
Further ado.
With no obvious questions, we will move on.
Okay, training employees. Jennifer, we seem to have a problem here. Can you go back and forth?
Yeah, where did it go? I don't know. We'll just have to speak to it.
Okay, so the failure here is the failure to provide training to your employees and to help them be prepared for execution. When I talk about training employees, I mean both training the general employee population as well as training those people who have specific roles and responsibilities so that they're ready to execute their duties. And I think one of the things that we want to do also is to encourage employees to be prepared and to practice at home. And I'll come back to that. The impacts, if you haven't done that, if you haven't trained your employees, you're not going to respond as quickly, as well, as efficiently as you want to be able to. Remember, if you're closed down for disruption, getting back in operation quickly is really important, and you want to do that both effectively and efficiently. You don't want to spend any more money than you have to because that increases the cost of your recovery. And you're losing revenue any time that you're not back in operating. So if your employees aren't ready to do it, you're spending time, and time is money. So, training employees, how do we go about doing that? Well, we want to provide a general awareness. Make sure that everybody understands you do have plans and where those plans can be accessed and what they are, because people want to look at and need to know what those general plans are. What's the plan for a fire? What's the plan for evacuation? What's the plan for this or what's the plan for that? And understand that. Make sure that they're aware of that and what they're supposed to do. Most of your employees are simply going to have to listen to what's being told to them to do and go do it. But there will be, in the next bullet, specific roles and responsibilities assigned to people for both response to the initial incident and for recovery. And those are probably going to be different people in a lot of cases. If you're small enough, then they won't be. But need to make sure that people know what their roles and responsibilities are and are prepared to respond and execute to them. And then we want to make sure that there's regular training to those employees who have assigned responsibilities. Because what we really want to do here is we want to develop the ability to understand what's going on, to see what's happening, and to react to it very quickly. Not to have to sit and think about it, because human beings don't do well thinking under the stress of an emergency or a crisis. If you're prepared, you'll do a lot better. And we want to encourage home preparedness. Our experience, and I'm sure your experience, is that home and family trumps business and job every time. So if people are comfortable that their family is prepared, that their home is safe and secure, that things are going well there, then they're going to, job becomes important when they're sure that their family and their home is secure. And how can you do that? Well, you can go to the Firestorm website and you can find the Disaster Ready People for a Disaster Ready America in PDF format, and you can download that for free. So your employees can get that book. It's an easy book to read. It lays it out in 12 straightforward chapters, and it's got a lot of good information in it.
Yeah, and it's devoted to home preparedness,
right.
And it has checklists and all sorts of good things in it, and is free, as Guy said, free as a PDF on our website.
Okay, so train your employees effectively, and they will be able to perform their roles and responsibilities in a crisis, and they'll be able to do that quickly and efficiently and get you back in the business.
So, Bill, do we have any questions on this part of the webinar?
I have a question that I'll chime in with.
Right.
Those books, what kind of content would be in there? And if we wanted to get a copy of the the paperback one that you're showing on the screen there, can I get some of the nice paperback copies?
You're throwing us an easy one, Amanda.
Well, I'm thinking we actually at Manufacturing Works should probably make sure everyone has a copy of that, and I didn't know you guys had that.
Yep, those are available as books as you see them from Firestorm, and all you have to do is contact us, and we will be happy to make them available to you. And for companies who want to actually provide these to their employees, they have a couple of different ways to do it. They can just buy the books as they are. We can also do some customizing of the books. We can put the company's logo on it. We also can customize to the extent that we can add a chapter that is specific to the company or an introduction from the CEO and that type of thing. So yes, these books are available in a lot of different formats, and we would be happy to provide them. If you contact us, we'll we will let you know.
And with respect to the content, Amanda, they walk you through a process that is the predict, plan, perform. What are your hazards, and how to go about determining what your hazards are locally, in a 5-mile radius, in a 10-mile radius, what you need to think about, and it walks you through in 12 chapters what needs to be done.
That sounds fabulous. I'm glad that you guys put that in front of all of us today, because I wanted to know about it too, so thank you.
I can't believe we haven't mentioned it to you, so that's great. Okay, are there any other questions?
No other questions.
All right, thank you. Then we will move on.
Okay, so the next one is identifying and monitoring threats and risks. And as I said, this is situational awareness. It's all about keeping track of the things that are important to you, and things that can hurt you are important. I like to always say that, you know, predators have eyes in the front of their heads. So wolves and tigers and eagles and hawks all have forward-looking vision because they need to be able to range find, and that stereo depth perception does that. Prey, on the other hand, have their eyes to the sides of their heads so that they can cover a much wider field of view so that they can maintain situational awareness, because predators, if they lose situational awareness, get hungry. Prey, if they lose situational awareness, are in big trouble. So identifying and monitoring all threats is just a failure to understand what is relevant to you in terms of threats and risks, and the failure to remain continuously aware of the proximity in both time and space.
Well, and going back to identifying all relevant risks, it's easy for us to identify the major risks, you know, the risk of fire, the risk of tornado, that type of thing. But if you give a lot of more in-depth thought to the risks that you face, you'll find other risks that you haven't thought of. There's risks from communicable illness. There's risks from social media, attacks on your business on social media. There's risks to your reputation and your brand. These are all the kinds of risks that you need to sit down and identify and think about and plan for, you know, not just the obvious ones.
And in fact, while I think everybody would probably say that Southern California businesses should have earthquake plans in place, you're only slightly less at risk of an earthquake in Wyoming than you are of a winter blizzard. So it's interesting when you start to look at the frequency and numbers of events. So it's important to do that. And the impacts, obviously, are that you may not be or you won't be prepared for all of the appropriate risks. And if you get caught flat-footed, you're slow to respond, you're going to be inefficient. You may, if you haven't looked at all of your resources, you may misallocate, or all of your risks, you may misallocate resources when you're doing planning. You may focus on a risk and impact that is not as great as something that you haven't considered. And that's all about losing efficiency and losing effectiveness in your response and recovery. Time is money, and we want to save you time, and we want to save you money. So the approach is to start with what we call an all-hazard perspective. Look at everything, and then get rid of the ones that aren't important. Do research on the ones that remain and understand what's the frequency of them, how at risk are you, what's the likelihood, and what's the impact going to be. And you can use a matrix like it shows down there at the bottom of this slide. It's just pretty simple. You know, certainty is lower high, impact lower high. That allows you to really start to do some triage on those and understand which ones are really important and which ones are the ones you need to address first. Once you've done that, you can prioritize, and you can put your plans in place, and you can then monitor for those identified risks and threats and do that on a continuous basis, which doesn't mean you hire somebody to sit there and worry about things all the time, but that you should not let a day go by where you haven't looked at this kind of information and understand what it is that's coming in your direction. So make sure that you understand the threats that you face and that you monitor for them. There are enormous resources available online to help you do that, whether it's the Center for Disease Control for Communicable Illness, or whether it's the National Weather Centers. They can help you find and understand what those potential risks are.
Are there any questions on this section, Bill?
No questions on this section.
Okay, we will move on.
Going back to that, making sure people are prepared, conducting exercises and updating plans. This is a failure to, even if you have a plan and people know what's in the plan, if you haven't developed proficiencies in the people who are assigned specific responsibilities, that's a real risk, because once again, it's the proficiency in it. So you have to have a plan, people have to be trained in it, and they have to be proficient in executing their assigned responsibilities.
Having a plan and having it sitting on the shelf doesn't do you any good, no matter how good the plan might be.
So, and that's absolutely right. Also, exercising those plans gives you the opportunity to identify and correct flaws in the plan. So I have a phrase that I learned a long time ago. It's LGOP, L-G-O-P, and that is looks good on paper. And what that means is that it looked really good until you tried to do it. Well, that's the benefit of it. That's one of the benefits of the exercise. You get to do it, and you find out where those things are when you have the chance to correct it, and you can keep it up to date. And keeping plans up to date is really important. Firestorm worked with a client a couple of years ago, and we'll call the particular person of interest here Fred. So in reviewing the plan, you know, Fred had assigned specific roles and responsibilities. And the only problem was that Fred was dead, had been for a couple of years. So when the time to find out that your plan has gotten a little old is not when you're exercising it for real, but when you're doing an exercise, you're doing an annual review of it. So the way to fix this is to exercise your plans regularly. So if you look at the graphics that are there, what those are is those are a series of scenario, an evolving scenario, a series of clips out of an evolving scenario that Jennifer and I put together that to exercise a specific portion of a plan. And so you sit down and do a tabletop exercise. We don't have to evacuate the plant or do anything like that, but sit down with the people who have roles and responsibilities and walk through a scenario and do it in real time. And by that I mean don't let things, you know, go by and let people spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on and how to do this and how to do that, because in a real crisis or emergency, the future comes at you at 1 second per second, and so you want your exercises to move forward at 1 second per second and put that time pressure on people so that you find those flaws and find places where you can do things better. Then capture the lessons learned. That is so important. Too many times people have lessons that are observed or even lessons that are admired, but they don't learn them, and so they get to repeat them again. And we don't want to do that. We want to take those lessons learned and go back into the plans and update them. So it's really important. Exercise your plans to make sure that you can respond effectively and that you have an opportunity to find the flaws and keep them up to date, keep improving them. Continuous improvement applies here just like it does anyplace else. Questions?
No
Any
questions
questions,
yet.
Bill?
Sounds like
Yeah.
All right.
By the way, audience,
You
you
must-
can enter a question on any subject anytime you want to. Thank you.
Yes,
Yep, you don't have.
that's correct.
Okay, so crisis communication planning. I said at the beginning that this is a really important area, and it is. And so I'm going to start off with a little bit of background here. Firestorm monitors a lot of internet communication, so Facebooks and web pages and social media and things like that. And it's rarely that a week goes by that we do not see a company somewhere in the country make a really horrendous error in crisis communication, one that damages them, seriously damages them. Their reputation primarily, the reputation and brand, but that's a serious thing. If you lose brand or you lose reputation, that can take years to get back. So it's really important to have a communication plan and to include a crisis communication plan. So the failure here is the failure to understand that, the importance of good communication. It's really, really critical. And as the state policeman observed in Cool Hand Luke, what we have here is a failure to communicate. And it's important to do that because it's really hard. Communication is a difficult, difficult thing. First thing we need to do is we need to understand and predetermine the goal of our communications in a crisis. So the failure is to do that. The failure is to determine the goal ahead of time. Once again, when Wolf Blitzer's talking to you, that's not the right time to figure this out. Now, I want to stop just briefly here and talk about messages, because when we talk about messages, we're talking about the meaning that we want to communicate, not necessarily the specific words, although we may have words and phrases we want to use. We're not talking about trying to script out ahead of time all this, but we want to identify what's the meaning that we want to transmit to the people we're communicating or trying to communicate with. It's important to predefine the right messages. And the failure to do that means you're inevitably going to say the wrong thing. It's like the CEO of British Petroleum when the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe was ongoing in the Gulf of Mexico. The CEO of British Petroleum, a multi-billion-dollar international global company, got on television and said, all I want to do is get my life back. Well, when you've just had 11 employees die in a catastrophic fire on an oil platform, that's probably not a message that you want British Petroleum to be putting out to the world. So you can't let things go and do it on the fly, ad hoc, just in time. Failure to predefine those right messages results in people making statements like that. The failure to identify the right audiences. We need to be able to identify, are we talking to our employees, and if so, what are we going to say? Are we talking to our customers? Are we talking to our suppliers? Who else do we want to talk to? Do we want to initiate discussions with the press? The answer is probably not. But you need to go through and ask those questions and identify those audiences. Then, for each one of those audiences and each one of the messages, how are you going to do it? You're going to put something up on a website? You're going to use Facebook? You're going to send text messages? You're going to make phone calls? You're going to send email? How are you going to communicate? Public address systems. How are you going to communicate to the people? It's the failure to do that means inevitably that the wrong message doesn't the wrong message gets to the people poorly, late, whatever. Really serious impacts, and it creates confusion. And that confusion means it's going to take longer and it's going to cost more to get back into operation, and it's going to cost money, and it's going to damage your brand and damage your reputation and maybe lose customers. So what do we do about it? Well, before we do that, I want to talk to you about Louisiana State University. About 18 months ago, there were a series of bomb threats to college and university campuses throughout the country. And in a few of those cases, there were actually explosive devices found by the local police and fire authorities, and they were dismantled and disarmed without damage and injury. But LSU got a bomb threat, and LSU. Now I'm going to pause again here for just a second. LSU, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a campus of about 2,000 or so acres. And what that does, what that translates into is if you're in the middle of the campus, you're about 12 or 1,400 yards away from being off campus in any in some direction. You're no further than that from being off campus. So LSU received this bomb threat, and they said, holy mackerel, we need to get as many people off campus as we can as quickly as possible. Let's tweet to people. So LSU sent out a tweet, there has been a bomb threat, evacuate the campus immediately. So being Americans, everybody on the LSU campus immediately jumped into their cars, roared out of the parking lots into that great American tradition, the traffic jam. And they jammed gridlock. They jammed every access road out of the LSU campus. Like you see in these pictures, these are actual pictures from LSU. Jammed every one of them. They not only stopped themselves from getting off campus, they prevented emergency responders from getting on campus, and it took almost everybody longer to drive off of that campus than it would have taken had they just walked off 1,200 yards. So what should LSU have done? Well, maybe the tweet should have been something more like, unless physically impaired, evacuate the campus on foot. Do not drive. Okay?
So the lesson that we take from this one is, don't let your communication cause a second crisis, and it often can if your communication is not clear and direct and the right one to have.
And that's all about thinking it out ahead of time. So crisis communication planning. So you should have a communication policy, and that communication policy should include your crisis communication. You should have a policy and a strategy for crisis communication. In it, you define the audiences. Remember that, the failure to define the right audiences? Who do you want to talk to? Then, once again, determine your messaging. Not the scripts, but the messages. And you should have core messages. And I will give you an example. About a year ago, I guess, right, Jennifer, Chevron had a fire in their refinery in Long Beach. And Chevron had thought about it. And they decided, we're going to use Twitter, we're going to be proactive, and the message that we're going to send is that we're on top of this, we care about the local community, we care about the people, we care about our employees, we're proactively addressing this and putting it under control. Nowhere did they use those words, but they were coming out with tweets about every hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, and the content of those tweets, when you line it all up, delivered that message with incredible force and clarity. They did an excellent job of using a media, having their messages lined up, and having a core message that said, we care about the local environment, we care about the local area, we're taking care of this. And they did. So you need core messages, and it should only be 2 or 3 core messages. You don't want to get that confused, but those then become the foundation for a series of message maps, which expand on that to say, if we're talking to employees, or we're talking to suppliers, we're talking to customers, we're talking to local responders, who are we talking to and what are we going to say? Once again, not necessarily in script, although these will be closer, not a script, but more the message I'm going to deliver to them as the situation evolves and moves along. So those are message maps. Do those. Then what's the appropriate mode? Is it Twitter? Is it a website? Is it email, text? What are you going to use? Because they have different time frames, different constraints, and it's important to have thought through that ahead of time. Then, critical, you do not want to be like this guy in the bow tie with all those microphones in front of you and the deer in the headlights look. You want to make sure that your spokespeople have been previously identified and they've been trained as spokespeople, because communicating can be very dangerous, and it doesn't take much to look on the evening news and watch people who don't have that training.
Well, and going back to the CEO of BP who just wanted his life back, had that gentleman been media trained and had he had his core messages and his message maps in his back pocket, he probably never would have said that and damaged his reputation and brand like he did.
Absolutely. And another example of that, too, is about 8 months ago, when the company in West Virginia had this chemical spill into the river, and their spokesperson was on television talking about the contamination of the water supply for the local area, and he was talking about how they were going to get it under control and how it wasn't really a big hazard, it wasn't really a big deal, and he was holding a bottle of water in his hand. So completely unintentional, but the message there, he's saying the water supply is fine and he's holding bottled water in his hand. And so really important to not let those kinds of things happen. And then with all of that done, there need to be action plans. Who's going to talk? Who's the alternate? Who's the second alternate? And make sure that that's all in there.
Well, and that's for external communications. It's really important that you have plans for internal communications. Our examples were all kind of about external and media, but a very big part of your crisis communications plan is how you're going to communicate with your internal stakeholders, how you're going to apprise people of what they should be doing, where they should be doing it, when they should leave work, when they should come back, those types of things. So your plans will have all of that in it. You'll have actions to take for any specific emergency. Okay.
Absolutely. Okay, so be prepared to communicate, not just talk or write. Be prepared to communicate effectively in a crisis. And I got one more story.
Oh, another story.
Another story. So about a year ago, Carnival Cruise Lines went through a series of an absolutely horrendous 6-8 weeks when it seemed like every Carnival ship that you heard about was stuck dead in the water at sea someplace, and their customers, their clients, were on national television holding up sheets saying, "Please help us, rescue us, we're lost at sea." And at that same time, Carnival Cruise Lines was issuing press releases. Well, press releases are almost the slowest way that you can possibly send communication to anybody. But the president and CEO of Carnival Cruise Line, while his clients are out without food and water on these ships floating around the middle of the Caribbean, is on TV, national TV once again, on the courtside watching the Miami Heat game. And so, once again, he's sending a message that what's happening to his customers isn't as important as they think it is. And they're issuing press releases that are moving at glacial speed. So once again, communication is a really complicated area and requires a lot of effort to do it well. Jennifer keeps telling me.
Yeah. Bill, so that's the end of this particular section. Do we have any questions at this point?
Not on this subject, but we do have an interesting question that someone has submitted. What are some factors that would help you prioritize your risks?
Okay. So obviously, the two key things to help you prioritize your risk, what's the likelihood? And then what's the impact? So you can have, and just really simplistically, going back to that little 2x2 matrix we had on the one slide, highly likely, not highly likely, high impact, not high impact. So if you have something that is likely and is high impact, then that's something you really need to pay attention to. So that starts off, but where you really need to start thinking about this is where you have things that are not likely but high impact. So the chemical spill in the river in West Virginia, that wasn't a likely thing, but is a hugely high impact kind of a thing. And so it's important to look at those. In probability and statistics, there's a thing called expected value. And it sounds really fancy. All it is, it's the probability times the cost. That's all it is. So if the probability if the odds are 1 in 100, the probability is 0.01. But if the impact is $1 billion, then that's a big deal. And so you take those kind of factors and put them together and look at that. And obviously, it's not just about dollars. It's also about life and safety. So the health, wellness, and well-being of employees and stakeholders is a big factor. And even if the dollar cost is not necessarily great, but there's a risk of injury or death, that becomes a big deal. And so you want to prioritize that more highly. So health, safety, and well-being comes first. That's the first thing you want to do. That's response to it, the event. And then you want to start looking at what's the impact and how do I start prioritizing this and what things do I need to bring back online first in order to get my company back in operation and my people back employed and getting their paychecks. So I hope that answered the question. If not, come beat me up.
Or ask another question and we'll continue.
So avoiding the common failures. And once again, remember, not every company that had a problem had all of these or even any of them, okay? But they showed up a tremendously high percentage of the time. And the way to deal with these, as it is with any area, is to predict what is it that I'm likely to experience and how likely am I to experience it and how big a deal is it. With that in line and those prioritized, develop the policies, what are we going to do, the processes and procedures, the details. And it's really important here not only what to do, but how to do it. Just about a year ago, there was a workplace violence incident here in Colorado, and one of the people at the organization went to dial 911, went to call the emergency number, could not, in the stress and the panic of the situation, could not remember 911. So it's really important when you put together these detailed processes that they're detailed enough that people don't have to do a lot of thinking, because like I said earlier, people, us, we're not real good at thinking from the ground up in an emergency. If we have checklists, if we have how-to plans, that really helps us do that. And then with the plans in place, practice, train, practice, and update. And when you've got those exercises done, then you can take the results of those back into the beginning and you can update and improve your plans so that you're always getting better. I really believe in continuous improvement everywhere. So with that, do we have any questions anywhere? So
we do not. You've done an excellent job.
Okay.
Well, so I either dazzled them or baffled them, Bill.
So we'll take another couple of minutes, though. We want to tell the folks in Wyoming the next webinar that will be coming up next month. We'll be expanding on one of these subjects, which is supply chain. Is your supply chain dangerously lean? So we will take the information that we've given you today and expand on that into things that you can do to make sure that your supply chain isn't dangerously lean and that you are mitigating the risk in your supply chain. And you can register for this one at manufacturingworks.com. We'll also be sending out invitations. We also have an all-day workshop coming up. The date is to be determined at the moment, but it's overall readiness, business survival, and ways to make your company disaster ready, to protect your people, your facilities, your intellectual property, gain competitive advantage through preparedness, and understand just how prepared your company is.
Jennifer, I just want to add on to that, and we really mean this. So part of that workshop will involve an assessment of your preparedness for you. This is a product that we Firestorm offer, and working with Manufacturing Works, we'll be offering it to the people who attend this workshop, and that assessment is priced significantly more than the cost of the workshop. So it's a really good deal.
And I want you to notice also that it does qualify for workforce training grant. So so you'll be able to take this workshop under the grant. So if you need any help, have any other questions, you can contact us. Here's Amanda's contact information and Guy's and Jennifer's as well. Amanda, did you have anything you wanted to add today?
I just wanted to add one thing, since we're working out the when and where for that workshop. If there's anyone who's interested, go ahead and drop me a line and let me know what time would work for you, what day. We're looking at February, but as mentioned, we're still nailing down the exact time and location.
Okay, great.
Okay, so if there are no questions,
thank you both very much for your expertise and sharing it with us today.
Thank you, Amanda. And if anyone has further questions, please feel free to contact us. And thank you very much for being with us today.
Okay, and Brenda, we will send you the link.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Have a good one.